Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another episode of the Legal Lunch Byte. My name is Jonathan Bench. I am thrilled today to welcome my friend Ricardo Aramburo Williams. He is a tax principal at Maury and Schoenfeld in Miami, Florida. Ricardo and I met a couple of years ago at an international conference, and he has an interesting perspective on things happening in and around Latin America. Definitely wanted to get his perspective. And I also, as the lawyer, I also like the tax perspective as well. So, Ricardo, welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invite.
So, give us a little bit of background on you personally and the type of work you're doing right now.
Of course, as you mentioned, I'm an international tax principal at Maury and Schoenfeld. I lead our Latin America services practice, meaning that I work a lot with the Latin American clients coming to the business to the U.S., expanding their operations in the U.S., or that already doing business in the U.S. and in other jurisdictions. We also work with many U.S. headquartered companies in establishing either manufacturing or services operations across Latin America. So really, our day-to-day work always relate to this space, in the relationship between the U.S. and Latin America, different countries across Latin America.
That's great. So maybe start with helping us understand which countries are part of Latin America. How far south do you consider Latin America? And maybe pick some of the countries that you see as front runners right now in terms of business leadership in the area.
Sure, of course. And there's always a bit of semantics involved in the term, if you will. But yeah, no, for sure. Latin America for us will be everything from Mexico to Argentina, and we will include in the definition Spain. We also have a lot of Spanish influx of business into the US, but also a lot of times it goes from Spain into Latin America, and it's somehow connected to the US. So we all consider this Latin America as, I will say, everywhere that people speak Spanish. Or probably that will be the best definition. And I will say that the front runners in the US relationship, particularly now, may have an interesting question mark that wasn't there before, because it might be like the front runners for what? Usually U.S. Companies, or before U.S. companies, weren't particularly interested in Latin American markets, other than companies that were really big and needed to expand it outside of the U.S. because market share here was already exhausted. We didn't see that many medium-sized companies expanding into Latin America. Now the story is different. So when we say which are the Latin American countries that are frontrunners, we can divide them. Either for setting up services and manufacturing operations for servicing the U.S. market, and then just interesting markets for U.S. companies. And the interesting markets for U.S. companies will be for sure Brazil and Mexico. Brazil and Mexico for size of the population and strength of the middle class. I will say those will be the front runners. Maybe you can include in that list also Chile, because it's progressive and it has a strong middle class, and it's also friendly for doing business, I will say, as a foreign company. And on the other hand of that, for setting up manufacturing and services operation, Mexico is still and as you know, it's the biggest trading partner of the U.S. And Mexico is still the number one destination for setting manufacturing operations. When we talk about services operation, imagine call centers or all sorts of shared services operations. We have a bunch of options. Panama traditionally has been there for sure. But now, for example, Costa Rica, I will say that Costa Rica, it's a front runner. They have a very friendly tax exempt regime for companies that operate in a free trade zone. So today, for companies, it's relatively easy to establish in Costa Rica, operate from there. They don't pay taxes in a number of years, really long number of years, and they also have this what they call their digital nomad visa, which I think is very interesting and that we will be seeing around the world, which is pretty much that if you move into Costa Rica, you just need to demonstrate that you have access to healthcare. And if you do that, you can still work for any company in the world, and Costa Rica will not tax you. That's obviously very attractive for many people around the world. Of course, if you're a U.S. citizen, you will still have to pay your taxes, in the U.S. But for every other country that doesn't tax you on citizenship, it's very attractive for many professionals. Obviously, more now than ever. So Costa Rica is there with Panama. Mexico is still strong for services rendering. I will say that also the ability of populations that are able to communicate in English is very relevant. So Argentina sometimes is there. Now that during the past few years, considering the disparity between the Argentinian peso and the dollar, kind of became attractive. That's going in a slightly different route now. And probably the other one that I think it's interesting is specifically the west part of Colombia. The west part of Colombia, they have invested a lot in developing capabilities for assisting U.S. clients with services and light manufacturing, particularly for servicing the U.S. West Coast. That's how they see it. They even have these studies comparing the cost for servicing the U.S. West Coast vis-a-vis servicing it from Mexico, which are interesting. Now, but I will say that still by volume, Mexico is far away from the other countries.
That's very interesting. So what kind of trends are you seeing? My practice is focused a lot on international supply chain movements, excuse me. So international supply chain movements from China to other places, as a lot of companies are exploring that. I know it's been in the news for years since COVID. How successful would you say that is right now from what you're seeing in Latin America? Do you see a lot of movement of companies, Asian companies coming into Latin America, or are you seeing more U.S. companies that are facilitating that? Like, what are some of the trends that you're seeing right now?
Sure. Sorry, it froze like for a second, but we're here. Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. So first, I clearly remember that, I think that it was in late 2018, so before COVID, late 2018, way before COVID. And I was having this meeting in which we were discussing potential mega trends that will affect foreign investment across the Latin American region and for the US. And we were specifically discussing the possibility of nearshoring because before it became, let's say, mainstream, because there were other situations and problems pre-COVID. You may recall the tariff situation was already there. Labor problems, IP protection problems. So there were situations that make companies already think that they could somehow reestablish their manufacturing operations closer to the US. Now, some of them even in the US. So it was either reshoring or nearshoring. And we start doing analysis on that. And of course, then COVID came by, and that was accelerated Timex. If you will, from an analysis standpoint perspective. Everyone has doubts. Everyone wanted to know. We did a lot of modeling, comparing the tax comparing the tax effects of doing it in different jurisdictions across Latin America and so on. But I will say that implementation-wise, the story has been different. The story has been different. And that's probably because there's probably a bunch of reasons, but first of all, Latin American countries have their own set of issues. When people say, yeah, there's a lot of issues with China, that's very true. But also Latin American countries have their own set of issues. And many of these issues relate to political, social, or economic lack of stability across jurisdictions. Even if things are going great in a specific country for the time being, it's very hard to assess what will happen in 5 years or 10 years. So when you're talking about taking these massive decisions that relate to all your manufacturing, it's hard to do it. So in practice, I will say we have seen way less actual migrations than the volume of analysis that we did for companies thinking about it. And the first, I will say, conclusion that we can see from that is that for companies that were or are manufacturing in China or in Southeast Asia in general, for addressing the Chinese or the Asian markets, of course, it makes absolutely no sense not to have their manufacturing on the other side of the world. So this is because in the beginning, people were saying, no, it's all my manufacturing. Everything it's a problem. It's hard to source the raw materials. It's hard to have the talent, the communication. I cannot. Well, first of all, no. The obvious first conclusion is that if you're servicing the Asian markets, you still want to have your presence there. No? And it's even by cost, it still makes sense. Now, with the deceleration of the Chinese market, no, it might make sense to look if it's the best option to service your U.S. market from other place, no? And that's where Latin America comes into place. And there we can see two things. First one is that if your operation is highly technified, meaning you have these manufacturing facilities that it's actually operated by four engineers, and by four engineers, you don't really need any more workforce. It's probably better to do it in a reshoring basis, meaning doing it from the U.S., not from the U.S. for servicing the U.S. market specifically. For operations that are more labor intensive, Mexico is still a very good alternative, particularly for manufacturing purposes. The Mexican maquiladora regime, which is a Mexican toll manufacturing regime, is fairly attractive. No, you end up paying a fair, yet minimal amount of taxes in Mexico calculated over the assets that you have. There are a couple of safe harbor models, but in the end, you pay a minimum tax on that. And the Mexican entity that you have in your structure can transform your raw inventory into finished inventory. The inventory is at all times property of the U.S. principal in that maquila relationship. Import-export process are, I will say, probably the best in the world, or the ones that are more simple in the world, and obviously outside of the EU, where you actually have no borders for this, but in any other jurisdiction, it will be more complicated. So the Mexico-U.S. relationship really flows in a really good way for manufacturing in Mexico, for servicing the U.S. market. Manufacturing everywhere else in Latin America, other than really light manufacturing, I will say it's complicated. As complicated, if not more complicated, than to do it from China or other South East Asia countries that have, I would say, more experience and more established processes for servicing the U.S. market. So when it's a manufacturing operation of certain scale, I would say that it's either Mexico or being where you are. That's the reality of that. When you are thinking in services, the story is very different. That when it's shared services, call centers, all sorts of places to service or where you can render services either internally, for groups that have certain scale, or to potential clients. Imagine a financial company that needs a service center, or a tech company that needs a user service center, or so on. There you have options. You can go into Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, and then the options can be very attractive. I will say they're always tax-driven and talent-driven. You need to be able to find the team that you're looking for. And I will say that to that regard, Costa Rica's population has really good qualifications. Large tech companies work often with Costa Rica and Costa Rica free trade zone regime. So yeah, you will have that mostly in Mexico and Costa Rica and in Panama, I would say.
That's great. So we've got about a minute left. This has been so fun to hear your perspective. What are your thoughts? This is an election year in the U.S. Of course, the tax code always changes at the end of every year, and that causes everyone to scramble in your world. What's on your mind as far as looking ahead to the election and potential tax code changes? I know it's a big question to end with, but give us a few points maybe.
For sure. I mean, there's no doubt that the rates as they are, I will talk in the rates in general, but as they are attractive to foreign investors, particularly to Latin American investors, for a variety of reasons. But imagine that usually you will have across Latin America corporate rates that are over 30%. So if you have a 21% rate, corporate rate here, I mean, you're already having a big margin there as to decide to reinvest in the US, specifically for tax purposes, right? There could be a variety of other reasons. But even if that changes, I think that the U.S. still will be very competitive, particularly when you when you put in perspective the market size and the other, all the other factors that you will consider while deciding to invest. So I mean, we can expect that as you know, there are many specific tax provisions, not many specific ways for structuring an operation. But in the end, I think that other economic factors, like the possibility of accessing a larger market, developing more technology, accessing to R&D credits, not funding the rest of your global operation from the US, are more relevant than taxes. Now, taxes are just a consequence. If you have to pay taxes, it's because you did a good business, right? So, of course, investors will always prefer lower rates, but I think that there are many other factors to take into that equation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ricardo. It's been great to catch up, and definitely we'll have you on again to get your perspective on how things are looking from your part of the world.
No, my pleasure, Jonathan. Anytime, of course. Glad to be here.